Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We'll be giving a bit of time for everyone to join today. Mhm. Right, I think we've got enough to kickstart the conversation, right? Okay, excellent. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you may be joining us to this webinar, Mainstreaming and Identifying Resources for Climate and Disaster Risk Reduction in Humanitarian Programs. Before we start the webinar, I'd like to share some technical and housekeeping details so that it would be easy for everyone to follow. This webinar is in English and we have live captions. To see these, you can select more with the three dots that you'll see on your screen on the menu bar, and you will see language and speech, and then you can turn live captions on and off from there. And on this, a kind reminder that English may not be everyone's first language. So please do be mindful of how we communicate and interact during the webinar. Thank you so much. We will be recording the webinar and it will be uploaded to the Charter Events website. We'll share with you that link later on. And we will have a question and answer time for all participants. So please do share your questions in the Q&A box that you see on the menu bar. And after the speaker's intervention, we'll be coming back to you on these questions. If you have a specific question for a particular speaker, please do indicate which one so that we can pose that question to that particular speaker. We also invite you to use the chat to introduce yourself to everyone on the call. And so first and foremost, thanks for being here on this webinar. My name is Nishani Jaimaha. I am the co-coordinator of the Secretariat of the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations. I am joined today by the other co-coordinator, Natasha Westheimer. We are so pleased to have the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, and the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership, REAP, co-convening this webinar with us today. Thanks so much to UNDRR and REAP, and especially UNDRR for having the webinar hosted on your platform as well. If we move on to the agenda slide, thank you so much, Marie. You will see that we'll be kickstarting this webinar with a panel discussion that will provide a framing on the topic and the theme. And we'll also be sharing and identifying what are the resources available for mainstreaming disaster risk reduction in humanitarian programming, with some of the experiences of organizations who are doing so already with case studies. And we will have the Q&A time. As mentioned, please do share your questions on the Q&A box. And following this webinar, we'll share with you some next steps on how we plan to take forward what we've heard during this webinar from speakers and from yourselves. So the commitment number one of the slide, I'd like to maybe, yes, thank you so much. For those who may not know, first maybe to quick kickstart, aware of the Climate and Environment Charter of Humanitarian Organizations. The Charter is a set of 7 commitments that was developed by the sector for the sector with an aim to guide humanitarian organizations and stimulate urgent and transformative action to help reduce the impacts of climate change and environment crises that we are facing. It sends a clear signal that we as a humanitarian sector need to act collectively, and that we have a responsibility to not only respond to humanitarian consequences of these crises, but we also have a responsibility to reduce the environment impact of our own actions. And the commitment 1 of the Charter very specifically calls on us to step up our response to the growing humanitarian needs and help people adapt to impacts of climate change and environmental crisis. It highlights the importance of reducing risks and vulnerabilities through an increased focus on climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, anticipatory action, and strengthening early warning and early action in the context where we work. While many organizations are including climate and disaster risk analysis in their work, they are and we're seeing that they're taking into account vulnerable populations that are either displaced, refugees, marginalized, people with disabilities, women, girls, boys, and those who are the most at risk into consideration in our programming. And organizations are doing preparedness and prevention activities with communities as their needs are diverse and not siloed into boxes like life-saving emergency or preparedness long-term needs. However, it's important to ensure that we are systematically including these aspects in humanitarian design, planning, and programming, and that we make our work climate smart. And despite the experiences of DRR, anticipatory action, early warning, early action, humanitarian actors are facing challenges in the sector, such as fragmented responses, lack of technical expertise, tools and guidance, underfunded community-led initiatives, which we hear quite often, and sometimes a limited recognition for the good work already being done. In addition, of course, humanitarian financing is often inadequate and unpredictable. And with the short-term project-based funding cycles we've got in the sector, restricting long-term resilience efforts that take time to bear fruit is something we see. And of course, the current funding landscape, where many humanitarian organizations are either shutting down their humanitarian programs and operations or having to cut down on even delivering life-saving aid, are struggling now to prioritize this. So we are hoping that today's webinar will inspire you with some of the opportunities available to systematically mainstream this work into humanitarian programming, and that it inspires you, that our speakers will inspire you of what they're sharing, their experiences, lessons learned, and opportunities on also for funding such initiatives. So through this webinar, we want to raise awareness, and we want to introduce the Charter signatories to the various types of approaches and resources available to mainstream and finance climate and disaster risk reduction and early warning, early action, and anticipatory action, including through some of the case studies. We will also share expertise and resources available to the sector to support mainstreaming activities into humanitarian program. And we'll share some of the challenges faced by Charter signatories in accessing funding for Commitment 1, and also identify opportunities for climate, environment, and DRR mainstreaming and funding. And last but not least, we will share how we take this forward for future global platforms. So without further delay, you can see we have a great array of speakers and organizations who are going to share experiences today. And we kickstart this with Amelia Wallstrom, Program Management Officer, Intergovernmental Processes and Interagency Cooperation and Partnership Branch from UNDRR, will provide us, Amelia, with a framing on the importance of mainstreaming DRR into humanitarian context. And then we will move over to Ben Webster, head of the Secretariat of the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership, REAP, with a framing on the importance of linking efforts across the climate and development and humanitarian communities. So over to you, Amelia.
Thanks so much, Nishani, for the great introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here on the webinar, and great to see that we have so many people from all over the world joining. So please keep writing in the chat as well where you're joining from. I see we have a lot of DRR experts, climate resilience experts already here in the webinar with us. I'm sure you have a lot of experiences to share as well. So my name is Emilia, and I work with the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, or DRR, on scaling up DRR in humanitarian action. UNDRR has been working on this area of work already for almost 10 years, working with humanitarian actors, recognizing, of course, that while humanitarian response is life-saving and fundamental, we also need to work on the underlying vulnerabilities and risk. And of course, also realizing that DRR is not an area of work per se, but it's an objective. And I think that we all do DRR in our daily work as humanitarians. Of course, a lot of us are involved. We're doing risk analysis. We are also involved in preparedness, which is a fundamental part of DRR. And anticipatory action is, of course, also part of the disaster risk management cycle and becoming more and more important also when we talk about innovative financing. I think we also know, and I've heard also from the Charter members, that there are a lot of challenges. And having worked on this line of work already for some time, I know that there is not always time. Humanitarian actors may not have the mandate or the technical expertise to work on DRR. At the same time, I think it has changed quite a bit in the past years, and we see that there is more recognition generally. I think what you see here on the slide, I think everyone agrees with. We will try to work on the underlying vulnerabilities and underlying risk and try to kind of work ourselves out of a job, even though that is perhaps optimistic. One thing that we see a lot more happening, which is great, is that humanitarian actors are working more with development actors. But also just to point out that this is not necessarily easy or quick. It takes more time, but the results will be better. You have here also a link, a picture of the scaling of DRR in humanitarian action, a checklist that we developed together with OCHA that we have also rolled out in a number of countries, which provides some tips and pointers on how to practically do DRR, whether it's about working with the development actors, whether it's about doing better risk analysis, or whether it's about working with the private sector, for example, and local actors. One of the other things we see, of course, is that funding for DRR is not enough, is not sufficient, and I'll talk about a little bit more about that at a later stage. If I can have the next slide, please. Here are just some examples that I wanted to share about what it means in practice to do DRR in humanitarian settings. Like I said, DRR is not a sector of work per se. It's something that everyone can do, whether you do it whether it's preparedness, response, or recovery. So, for example, in South Sudan, a risk working group was established with the support of UNDRR. That brought together actors from across development and humanitarian spheres, also across sectors and clusters. And that really then paved the way for joint risk analysis and working together across these different actors, building on a joint risk analysis and a shared understanding of risk. Also very pleased to know that we've been working now with the Global Shelter Cluster on integrating DRR in shelter cluster operations, building on their work on mainstreaming environment, where we partnered again with UNHCR and local NGOs who have that access to the IDPs, to the displacement settings, to really do like concrete risk mitigation action. And also in Madagascar, where we were able to put together a DRR advisor who again was able to kind of play that coordinating role and bring people together. So just a couple of examples there of how this can look in practice. And with that, I'm handing over to Ben.
Thanks so much, Emilia, and thanks, Nishani, for the introductions as well. It's a real pleasure to join you all today for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because I was part of the advisory committee a few years ago when the Climate and Environment Charter was being developed and established. So it's really encouraging to see what progress has been made over the last few years, and how it is helping humanitarian agencies to integrate these approaches into our day-to-day work. So that's really encouraging. And secondly, because this topic is extremely relevant for REAP, which is the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership. As you may be aware, the partnership was launched back in 2019 to help bring together the climate, development, humanitarian communities across governments, civil society, private sector, UN agencies, academia, to really try and scale up early warning and early and anticipatory action to help integrate risk-informed approaches and scale them up. So when colleagues from the Climate and Environment Charter Secretariat said, can we do this event together? We said, absolutely, this is very much in our interest. So it's great to see you all online today. I guess there are two main points that I would like to make. Not only is this discussion relevant in the age of climate change and as we see more extreme weather events and compounding crises in the months and the years to come, but it's also very timely. So in the current context of shrinking aid budgets, we're going to have to do things smarter and more effectively. So being able to not only respond to saving lives and protecting livelihoods in the short term, but also trying to reduce risks in the longer term is going to become crucial for all of us. So there are a couple of things that I wanted to share. One, I've just pasted in the chat box a link to a publication from ODI in 2023 on building forward better. So they provide some analysis on how do we link and layer these different interventions, but also sequence them so that we're not only looking at short-term crisis response, but how does that feed into longer-term risk reduction, development plans, climate change adaptation. So that's in terms of how we can do this more effectively and efficiently. The other item that I wanted to flag was something that as a partnership we worked on in 2023 as well. We're working in partnership with the government of the United Arab Emirates as they hosted COP28. And we launched the Charter on Getting Ahead of Disasters, which looks specifically at finance. How does the financial architecture need to adapt and change so that we can get ahead of disasters, pre-arrange the finance, take more anticipatory proactive action, but also link across our climate, development, humanitarian portfolios. So like I say, a very timely discussion as we have a shrinking aid budget environment. How can we do these more effectively? The last thing I wanted to say, and this is coming from the humanitarian sector, having worked for the last 20 plus years in the humanitarian sector, I think I'm able to say that sometimes we start with humanitarian needs first and foremost, and having worked from a slightly different vantage point over the last few years, I can see that the humanitarian sector is one small piece of the overall jigsaw puzzle. And so it's not a case of all of us trying to do everything, you know, expanding mandates and trying to take on more and more work, but how can we collaborate effectively with others and understand where is our unique added value, but where do we need to link up? As Amelia said, it's not always easy, but it is much more effective, much more efficient in the longer term. So how can we identify our respective roles and responsibilities, team up with others, divide out the resources accordingly, not try and take on everything ourselves. And that's where, as a partnership, as a platform, we really want to help facilitate those discussions and ensure we can understand each other's perspectives across the climate, development, humanitarian communities from all those different perspectives. So I'll leave it there so we can get into the panel discussion, but really good to see you all online. And Nishani, back over to you.
Thanks so much, Ben. And absolutely spot on, Ben. We do really need to look at a smarter way of working. And this is something that we're hoping with some of the experiences we have that we can share during this webinar as well. And of course, in the sector, there's so much going on. And to move on to our next speaker, Sandra Ruiz Romero, who's the Policy Officer of Disaster Preparedness with with DG ECHO. Sandra will be sharing with us on the multi-risk approach to humanitarian programming, and would be great to hear from ECHO on how the approaches are. So over to you, Sandra.
Thanks so much, Nishani and colleagues of the Climate Charter and also from UNDRR, and happy to see the many participants, many known names, many known faces, former colleagues. Well, we are all in the same humanitarian sector, as you said. We are in special times, and we need special way of working now. Disaster preparedness. So this is very core to the heart of the work of DG ECHO. And next slide, please. I would like to explain why disaster preparedness is so important for DG ECHO. I'm sure all of you are familiar with DG ECHO, so I don't want to take more time on that part and jump straight to why we want to talk about disaster preparedness and why DG ECHO looks at it in a specific way within a specific budget line and a specific disaster preparedness policy. I have also posted the DG ECHO DP guidance note in the chat box for your information. Also, I have posted training, and I will be posting later on a few more tools that we have for the whole sector. As you know, DG ECHO works with accredited partners. And why disaster preparedness? We go to our core. So we have, we know all, we acknowledge that crises have increased frequency, impact, and sometimes it's a bit overwhelming. And humanitarian crises are becoming more protracted, unpredictable, and complex. The current crises are overlapping. There is what we call this compounded risk, or the overlaps between the impact of natural hazards, fragile situations, or human-made crisis. And we see specifically, by the European Commission sees specifically climate change as a threat multiplier, specifically in fragile contexts. Next slide, please. As I said, please know that we have a guidance note that you can find. It's open source, and we take from UNDRR. So thanks, colleagues from UNDRR, a very dear partner to us. Of course, the definition of what is disaster preparedness for us. What we know is that working on disaster preparedness can increase, and tackling disaster preparedness can increase the quality and timeliness of response operations. We really want to see, and we are really advocating for more disaster preparedness across all the humanitarian actions funded by DG ECHO. All humanitarian actions funded by DG ECHO, we are expecting to see disaster preparedness action and disaster preparedness mainstreaming. Disaster preparedness actions would help to act before crisis, will save lives of our beneficiaries and communities, and will reduce suffering. And it will decrease, and I think this is a very important point, it will decrease humanitarian needs. And we are in a space now where budgets are shrinking, humanitarian movement and access is also shrinking. So we have to really try to work more in coordination, how to have a sound disaster preparedness strategy, and basically try to respond to humanitarian needs. Next slide, please. You can click a bit further, please. So disaster preparedness is aligned with the IASC Common Framework for Preparedness. I'm sure you are all familiar with it, but I want to specifically mention it. The primary responsibility for the safety and security of the own citizens falls with the government of the land, so the national leadership. And that's very important for DG ECO because we practice it within the European Union borders, and our member states are also taking that part too. So the government, unless a party to a conflict, will bear the primary responsibility for the preparedness and safety of its own citizens. We are not proposing to deliver substitute capacity. We are proposing to work system-built approach to work as much as possible with the governance of that territory, of that national government. And that's very important for the local and localization agenda. Future services, and also working with the national disaster risk management capacity, with their strategy and working to support the policy. Next slide, please. Well, this is a very known concept to all of you, but this is where we want to, as European Commission, as DG ECO, this is where we want to have an impact. We want to look at hazard and exposure. We want to also tackle the vulnerability and the coping capacity. So those are the components that, as you know, are the compounded risk concept. Next slide, please. And for our tools, and basically it's our guidance note is supported by a disaster preparedness budget line. We have a process for that. We select the countries where we are going to work. We work with our field network on that, on the selection of the process and on the programming year to year. We are working already on 2026 process. We are, as I said, we are really prioritizing system-built approach, governance processes, and not isolated processes. We would like to see more of the classical governance support, capacity building, working with the government. That seems to be something from the past, but it's not, as Nishani said, is more than ever important to work with disaster preparedness and the governments. Next slide, please. So we move to the disaster preparedness mainstreaming. For us, it's very, very important to work on disaster preparedness mainstreaming. As I mentioned, we do emphasize that need. We want to see disaster preparedness mainstreaming in every funded action of DG ECO humanitarian support. We are promoting that. We want to see good and sound multi-risk informed approach and analysis. And we want to also specify, you will see, which are our priorities in the guidance note. Next slide, please. Which are target preparedness, specific actions with our specific budget line, which is not a separate funding process. It's part of the HIP process that our partners are working with. The next priorities, and next slide, please, for the different priorities, 4 main priorities, and our cross-cutting themes that you all know and you can see here. Next slide, please. I don't want to take much time. I know Nishani needs her time, and sorry for that.
Sorry, we're up on time. Yeah, we can share the slides with the participants.
Great. So that's more or less all from my side. I can share some good practices, and I can reply to your questions as much as possible.
Thanks so much, Sandra. Thanks. It was really informative, and I think there's a lot that we can take from how also donor priorities, but at the same time how programming is working, that we can work towards integrating better, and to look at the way we work and how we modify, especially the way with the funding crisis in the humanitarian sector right now. And I'm going to now transition to Natasha, who will give an overview of the resource available, ranging from guidance, tools, trainings for organizations to mainstream. And that was something that we wanted to share also afterwards, where Emilia will then follow on some of the pointers for funding opportunities. So over to you, Natasha.
Thanks, Nishani. I'm really excited to be sharing a bit about the tools and resources for mainstreaming climate and DRR today. Not just because there's so much out there already, we've already had links shared in the chat, but also because today the Secretariat is launching a new platform that will be rolling out this year that really demonstrates the extensive expertise we have in our community. But before that, on the next slide, I've included the four core functions of the Secretariat for those who are not yet familiar. And what I want to highlight here is that the Secretariat was established to essentially be a referral hub for the humanitarian sector, to connect to tools and resources and expertise on climate and environmental action, on the commitments of the Charter, whether that's through one-on-one support to organizations or webinars like this one, or in our newsletters and in our communications. And since we launched last May, Nishani and I have been working to best understand how we can help the sector bridge the gap in technical expertise. As part of this, we've been identifying and mapping the tools and resources and expertise that already exists. And on the next slide, you'll see, or you're on the slide, great, one step ahead of me. You'll see a visual of the resources and platforms we've identified so far. The expertise mapping began with a foundational assessment in 2021, updated again last year by Group URD, funded by ECHO. And we've continued to expand and deepen this mapping, especially learning from signatories, and we're working to organize it in the best way we can share it with the sector. And you'll see here we have over 250 resources. It's pretty incredible, ranging from tools and guidance documents, online learnings and courses. There are working groups and networks, as well as even just some comprehensive resource libraries and support desks tackling some of these big thematic areas. On the next slide, I just wanted to give you a little heads up on where this is going, but we'll be working on publishing a series of guides, guidance pages on our website, focusing on various themes, where we'll curate these resources in a way that we think will be most accessible. And as you see, they're really quite specific. So the one we're sharing today will just be about DRR, but later we'll be having ones on early warning, early action, anticipatory action, various thematic topics. And we'll be hoping to roll these out every 2 months or so. And where possible, we'll do a webinar like this one, where we can hear from experts, we can hear from organizations doing this work. And before I dig into the DRR resources, I just wanted to note that now that we have this mapping database, organizations and signatories to the Charter should know that first, we're still available to help you find resources you may be looking for. You can reach out to us one-on-one. The Secretariat will still remain a contact point. And additionally, this mapping and the platform is dynamic. So you should always keep in mind to share resources, tools, case studies, or expertise that you have that you'd like to make available to signatories, which we're happy to share. And we'll talk about that towards the end on how you can reach out. On the next slide, today we launched the DRR page, and what's so incredible is the amount of resources and tools that exist to support the work we're talking about. Many of them come from organizations on this call, from the sector. UNDRR and REAP have already shared a couple, and we started posting with over 30 resources organized into different categories. So there are a few, for example, that are really great beginner content. What do we mean by DRR? How do we start? There are 7 online learning and training opportunities, all of them free to access, including a game. There's 10 technical guidance notes and resources, 4 tools, 5 different platforms for engaging, whether it's a working group or a network for knowledge sharing, as well as a handful of case studies. And I'll show you just some examples, but we'll drop a link into the chat with the link to the page that you can explore on your own. On the next slide, you can see the CARE Climate Resilience Academy. It's an online learning platform and capacity sharing initiative run by the CARE Climate Justice Center. They have a number of resources. We've pulled out a couple trainings and online self-paced courses and guides. So you can see here a screenshot of the guidance page. Under technical guides, we've included 3 resources, such as this one on integrating gender in climate change and disaster risk reduction. in their courses, they have one on developing and implementing GCF funding proposals. On the next slide, you'll see the CEDRIC tool. This one was developed by the Swiss Agency for Development Cooperation, and it's a three-part practical tool for humanitarian organizations to integrate climate, environment, and DRR. It always starts with a rapid screening, the CEDRIC Lite, and prompts you to additional modules based on various factors in your operations. And that's just one of a few tools on the site. And on the next slide, just one more I'll show you. This one's an example of one of the knowledge sharing platforms and engagement opportunities we've identified. The Global Network of Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Reduction is an international network of civil society organizations working to strengthen resilience of those at risk of disasters. And there are many ways this network offers opportunities to share knowledge and collaborate and engage as members, and it's open to membership. So with this example, I'll wrap up here, noting again that we are happy to hear from you on additional resources, whether on DRR or other thematic areas. Of course, I'm happy to answer questions later in the webinar. And I'll hand over to back to Amelia at UNDRR. And just to say, some of our primary resources on the page are coming from UNDRR, including the checklists shared before and comprehensive guidelines, online learning on DRR in the humanitarian program cycle. So we're really excited to hear from Amelia on some of the further insights UNDRR is developing on the financing front. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Amelia.
Thanks so much, Natasha, and excited to see that DRR thematic page. It's great to have someone curate all of the guidelines and resources that are out there, because there's certainly a lot that exists. So now moving on to the funding, which is maybe the exciting thing, and I wish I would have some pots of gold to share with you automatically, but I do not, unfortunately. Just to say, as way of intro, funding for DRR, environment and climate in fragile context is pretty complicated, because there's a lot of different funding sources. There's development assistance, there's humanitarian funding, there's bilateral funding, there's funding that falls outside that isn't being tracked anywhere. So UNDRR had a study a couple of years back looking at funding. And we also do budget tagging and tracking in different countries to see like how much they invest on DRR. And it often goes into definitions, like what really is DRR and what are we using this for? I think all of what we do know, of course, is that ODA is still important in many contexts, and also climate change adaptation funds are key. And I think that's also what a lot of the humanitarian actors are sensing and seeing. And I think because there is this very close links and overlaps between humanitarian action and development, looking at underlying vulnerabilities and risk, that's where you can address some of that through climate change adaptation. Also good is that we, of course, have a lot of new financing mechanisms under development and operationalization. Maybe not all of them are applicable to NGOs, but still on the whole, this is good news. Next slide, please. What UNDRR has done, and we'll share the guidance, the document with you also in the chat, is we put together with the Global Shelter Cluster kind of a quick outline of what types of DRR funding exists and environment and climate funding. But one of the things that we do want to highlight is kind of that importance of looking really at your programs, looking at your context. Who are the different actors there, and what are the funding that's needed? Because some of it might be humanitarian and some of it might come from other sources, and then you can have kind of auxiliary programs that will support your humanitarian programs. And then the other thing is, when we started looking into funding sources, we realized very quickly that it's impossible to come up with like one mapping that would be good for all actors in all countries, cover all types of activities. So I think it's, so what we decided to do is to have kind of this overarching overview document. And instead, what we recommend is that you really sit down with your key partners in country, look at your action plans, look at what you have funding for, look at the priorities, and look at what might be applicable to your situation. And really, again, try to leverage those multi-stakeholder partnerships. whether it's joint funding or whether you're just working in the same context, but on different projects, but leveraging each other's experience. Those are some of the recommendations. Next slide. I'm not going to go into this in detail. I'll put the link in the chat for you. You can have a look at the document. This is work in progress. It's a technical document. It's not supposed to be complete. It's not supposed to, you know, apply to all the organizations, but we'd be very happy to get any feedback and to also hear from you on what might be helpful. And just to say again, there's some of those interesting new opportunities as well that Sandra also spoke about, like crisis modifiers, insurance that are coming in, private sector funding. So let's look to that as the environment is getting more challenging. That's it from my side. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Amelia. Really useful, and we will be sharing the links and the presentation as mentioned. And interesting of the opportunities that are there at the national level, Amelia, that you pointed out. And we're going over now to Paul Moyo, who's the Disaster Management Coordinator of the Zimbabwe Red Cross Society. Paul, there's a lot of work going on the ground and happening. Local perspectives are important, and the resilience and preparedness work that you're doing on the ground. So it would really be good to find out from you and hear from you on how the approaches taken by the Zimbabwe Red Cross Society on how you're mainstreaming climate risk, resilience, and anticipatory action into your programming. And also, I'm sure this is also very important and interesting for others to hear on the webinar today, is how are you actually looking at fundraising, and what are some of the challenges and opportunities that you have seen as Zimbabwe Red Cross on the ground to fundraise for such programming? So over to you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Nishan. My name is Paul Moyo. I'm the Disaster Management Coordinator, as she has introduced me, and we are pleased to be part of this platform as the Zimbabwe Red Cross Society, and we are happy to share our experience. Maybe you can go to our next slide. Okay, so in terms of our presentation, I will look at anticipatory action, climate change issues, disaster risk reduction issues, sorry, as well as early warning systems. And I will also touch on resilience and climate smart agriculture practices, techniques that we have managed to mainstream in our programming in response to climate change. And also I'll touch on community-based adaptation and methods or approaches that we have used as Zimbabwe Red Cross, and some of the collaboration and partnerships that we have managed to build around issues of disaster risk reduction. And lastly, I'll look at fundraising initiatives that we have put in place as Zimbabwe Red Cross. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of climate change, we have managed to do a lot of co-designing of projects with communities, where we go out, we consult communities on the impending disasters, the risk, the hazards that they face as a community, and then we try to come up with activities to address those challenges or to alleviate suffering and loss of lives. And in terms of co-designing those projects, we work closely with the government and other partners that are operating in that space. And also, as Zimbabwe Red Cross, we have a contingency plan that we have developed for 2025, looking at the impending hazards or risks in Zimbabwe. And in that contingency plan, we've identified famine, floods, and epidemics. And under epidemics, let me emphasize to say, as a country, we are expecting an increase in cholera cases, an increase in human anthrax and other diseases. So for us, it is a priority, and we have projects that are addressing those kind of issues. And also we have disaster management plans in place for us to work closely with communities, even at community level. Next slide, please. And then in terms of climate risk assessment and early action, early warning systems, we have developed a working relationship with communities on the ground to make sure that we do early warning messaging to the communities. We reach out to the communities as much as possible so that we make sure that we don't leave anyone behind when it comes to messaging for early action. And we are doing this at national level, where we're an active participant in community of practice on anticipatory action. We are also participating at regional level as Zimbabwe Red Cross on anticipatory action activities. And we have also trained staff and volunteers on disaster management, disaster preparedness, response, recovery, and other activities that we are doing. And also in terms of capacity building, we also establish and train committees on climate risk management at community level, as these are expected to be our first responders when a disaster strikes. And as I've said, we are improving also in early warning messaging at community level, taking advantage of community meetings, disseminating messaging at institution level. I'm talking of the schools now, using radio messaging, our volunteers also disseminating messaging, but working closely with our Department of Meteorological Services, because these are the custodians of that kind of information. And as I've said, our Zimbabwe Red Cross volunteers, they are very active when it comes to the dissemination of information at community level. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of anticipatory action, I think we have all embraced the concept, and the Zimbabwe Red Cross, we were not left behind on such, looking at the advantages associated with anticipatory action. I think from that slide, you can tell that the first line, anticipatory action concepts were not applied where there was an impending hazard, the time when the hazard occurred, there was early warning, yes. And if you look at the number of hands raised there are many compared to the number of hands raised on the last line. Even if you look at the one who's bringing in funds, you would realize that there is more funds that are required if there is no anticipatory action as compared to where there is anticipatory action. Because where there is anticipatory action on the next line, there is an impending hazard or disaster. Some funds are injected and it's just $1 according to that illustration. A disaster occurs, the number of people affected, they are less than on the upper line, an indicator that anticipatory action, you lose less lives, you also invest less. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of our resilience building activities, including livelihoods, as Zimbabwe Red Cross, we are implementing quite a number of projects to build resilience to our communities so that we reduce vulnerability through livelihoods diversification, where we are introducing options on livelihoods that are not that are climate proof, and we are looking at climate smart agriculture practices, even those livelihoods that are not dependent on rain-fed water and others, so that we make sure that they are resilient. Next slide, please. Okay, and also on community-based adaptation, we have worked closely with communities to make sure that they adapt to the prevailing climatic conditions And if they adapt, then they transform and absorb whatever challenges that they might be going through. And with that, we come up with projects that are addressing their immediate needs and also looking at long-term development needs moving forward. Next slide, please. And then on Zimbabwe Red Cross funding initiatives, I think we all agree that the funding space has been shrinking over the years, and recently I think it has become worse. But we have tried to be innovative enough so that we have this business continuity as we do our operations. So we do provide health services in Zimbabwe, and we have clinics in Harare, that happens to be the capital city, where we provide medical services, and the community in the city pay for these services. And we also have education services, where we have a high school in Harare, and we have an enrollment that pays for the service, and we are also able to raise funds for the organization to continue with its mandate to save lives. And also we conduct training of nurse aides, basic first aid, and we also do trainings in schools in all provinces of the country in an effort to raise funding for us to continue to exist. And we also have kiosks in all provinces, especially in hospitals, where we provide food and other services there in an effort to raise funding for our activities. And also, Zimbabwe Red Cross is a membership organization where members subscribe on a yearly basis. We have professional members, some who are life members who pay life membership. We have school children also contributing to the existence of Zimbabwe Red Cross. And we also work with partners like the Finnish Red Cross, the Danish Red Cross, British Red Cross, IFRC. They are also in Zimbabwe assisting us with fund-raising activities to support some of the disaster initiatives or activities that we're implementing in country. And also we have worked with other donors like the EU. We have received funding from USAID, although challenges at the moment. We have also received funding from other donors. I've just mentioned those two, and they've supported our initiatives, interventions at community level as a humanitarian organization to save lives.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.
Paul.
Thank you.
Paul, we'll come back to you during the Q&A time as we are running short of time for this particular segment. Very interesting ways of fundraising and also mainstreaming DRR into your programming. So I would like to go from a national perspective that Zimbabwe got onto to an international NGO, Save the Children. So Nick, we've got you online today. Nick is the Director of Climate Change. And Nick, one of the things that we'd like to pick your brains on is that Save the Children became accredited to the Green Climate Fund, so one of the more international funds in 2019, and has been accessing climate financing for a few years now. And from what we gather, you're working in 7 countries through this programming. So why climate financing from the GCF cannot be used for humanitarian response? Could you share some insights into the challenges and, of course, the opportunities of humanitarian sector could access climate financing? So over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be on. So yes, you are correct. Like any UN funding mechanism, there are rules behind it, and one of those rules is the climate finance mechanisms can't be put towards humanitarian action, and that's to ensure that there's complementarity between funds and there isn't any duplication. Saying that, before I touch on what is eligible and how that relates to this group, I think it's important to touch on the how as well. The climate finance mechanisms, especially the Green Climate Fund, have been set up for countries to access. They're international funds for countries to access to both reduce mitigation, so to reduce their greenhouse gases and contribute towards mitigation, and of course, adaptation. They are meant for governments to put behind their national policies and plans, like locally led mechanisms, so very much aligned to the humanitarian localization agenda. And whilst they're new mechanisms and they're not perfect, and there are still a lot of challenges, they're so complicated to access, it can make it difficult for local access. In essence, and what they're trying to do is correct, is right, and hopefully will be easier for countries to access. But the what, I was going to talk about all the different things, but Paul has just done it for me. So everything that Paul has just described in terms of your project in Zimbabwe is very much eligible for climate finance. With the Green Climate Fund and other mechanisms, when you look at how we address the challenges that climate change is going to throw at us, disaster risk reduction is key to that. It's absolutely key. So whilst we can't pre-stock goods for humanitarian action or cash programming, all of the early warning systems, the preparedness, the anticipatory action, the disaster resilience, all of that is entirely fair game for climate finance. In fact, encouraged. The Green Climate Fund are signatories or partners to early warning systems for all. The angle that they take is very much how do we link in climate information services so our early action is informed by the best latest climate science as well as their weather reports and so forth. And I think it would be fair to say that, I mean, it is great Paul has gone over all of the things that of the 7 projects we have, they all have aspects of disaster risk reduction in them. And I'll just give one example, our Vanuatu community VCCRP, I'm going to forget what the actual name of the project is. We use acronyms so much. It's a locally led adaptation project in Vanuatu that reaches 45% of rural communities. And the cornerstone of that is working through the climate change and disaster risk reduction local committees, doing all the sorts of things that Paul was talking about in terms of organization, early warning system, preparedness for disaster response. The key with a climate finance mechanism and the pressure testing they'll put anyone under is putting it in is what is the climate problem you're addressing? So you always have to link it back. And there are also constraints with that because often in the world of disaster risk reduction, we look at it at all hazards approach. But climate finance mechanisms, you have to show the climate science, 30 years back data, 30 years forward data, what are the impacts of climate change, and why is therefore this intervention justified? But I would imagine that most, if not all of you on the call will know that the natural hazards that are turning into disasters now are pretty much all exacerbated by climate change. And it's not particularly, it's difficult sometimes to link to the data because of the availability of the data, but not because it's not happening. So that's really the key there. Also, I know that you're looking at very much the fragile and conflict affected states. They're very much eligible for these as well. You get the double whammy of crises. Most conflict places are exacerbated by natural hazards, leading to disasters as well. So in the context of climate finance, a program would be more focused on how to reduce the impacts or mitigate the impacts of a natural hazard, even if you're looking at an all hazard approach. So again, it comes back to linking to climate science. The last thing I'll touch on in here is something that Ben talked about at the beginning, and it's partnerships. So I know a lot of the organizations there's a sliding scale of dual mandate organizations to the more purist humanitarian organizations like the ICRC or Médecins Sans Frontières, but we work in different configurations of partnership in the field, and it's those configurations of partnership that often expand the work that we do from humanitarian to development and disaster risk reduction in between. So in thinking of what we can do and how we can access it, it's also very much about with whom.
Thanks, Nick. And the other question is you mentioned about how you work in fragile context. Can you give some examples of where you are starting to work in, perhaps, and so that and who do we partner with would be interesting to really kind of nail on.
So Save the Children don't work with the Adaptation Fund or the Global Environment Facility at the moment. We're not accredited to them, much as we'd like to be. We work primarily with the Green Climate Fund. And I know the Green Climate Fund have set up a task team at the moment to look about how to better work in fragile and conflict-affected states. So there's a group of people across geographies and thematically looking at how do we mobilize climate finance, which is renowned for being quite slow, quite clunky, and quite procedural, but they are very much looking at how we tweak and how they can tweak and adapt it, because they do want to get that funding into fragile and conflict affected states. We work in Mali, we have a project coming through in South Sudan. Often where it's a bit of a challenge is the policy environment of the Green Climate Fund has, you look at your environmental and social safeguardings, organizations are different categories, you look at the impacts of the program on indigenous groups, and through that lens, they often pressure test a project in terms of how will the funds that come from the mechanism not exacerbate conflict and in fact do the opposite. But it's a very high bar. It's quite an academic high bar in terms of how you put it through. Whereas the likes of, I know Paul and other Red Cross societies who work in these places are, familiar with how you work within contexts where there is fragility. But in terms of partnering, the other key thing, we have a fair amount of organizations that sort of approach us on how could we partner on these sorts of interventions. The key to that is it's not about us. We're a vehicle because not enough countries have direct access yet. So they use internationally accredited entities such as Save the Children. But at the end of the day, we are designing programs with and for government. And we are at the request of the government. We go in and say, what would you like us to support with? Well, often these are the things we're good at. Are you interested in getting the support? And how would you like it to roll out? And that is also very much to do with partnerships. So somewhere in the early stages of a design, we will be asking what they call the National Designated Authority, which is the formal focal point for a country into the GCF mechanism. Who is your desired configuration of partnerships that you would like to bring into the project? So for any of those on the call who are thinking about how can we be involved, how can we bring our disaster risk reduction or anticipatory action experience, I think the message from me would really be talk to your national designated authority and their office. Find out what their priorities are. Find out if what you do will complement and support what they are trying to do. Because if we come in like any other international accredited entity and what we're planning to or what we're proposing to do overlaps, it's the national designated authority will say, we think you should work with this organization or that organization or this line of government or that line of government. So we very rarely, if ever, come in with a pre-identified agreed of partnerships because it's very much a locally driven mechanism and we are there at the invitation of the government to fulfill what they want to do and how they want to do it. And we're there to do that academic bit of how do you then access the funding so that they can get it into their priority areas.
Thanks so much, Nate. Really useful tips, I think, for everyone on the call to look at, also the value add as a humanitarian actor on the ground, what we can bring to the table with other partners and actors, and what our capacities are as well, and how do we then look at supporting some of the larger programs like the national adaptation plans, etc., that are there in place and that drive some of these forward. Thanks so much for the insights. If anybody has questions for all the panelists who have spoken so far, please do share this in the chat. And now I'm going to hand over to Natasha, who's going to take on the next part of the session that will also provide some case studies and the Q&A. Over to you, Natasha.
Thanks, Nishani, and thanks as well to all of the panelists. Again, please do share questions, ideally in the Q&A box, and then panelists might be able to answer as they come in, but we'll have time for that shortly. For the remaining time, we want to hear from you, from the participants, and we'll do three things. First, we want to hear from you on some of the themes we discussed today. We'll have a Mentimeter in a moment. And then we'll hear from two participants who, in advance of the webinar, already shared some thoughts with us, and we want to hear their contributions on and experiences in mainstreaming DRR. And then we'll open the floor to questions. But to frame this piece, I'll start by sharing that last month, the Secretariat opened a survey to Charter signatories on their priorities for collective advocacy within the Charter community. We heard from almost 100 organizations from over 50 countries about the challenges they're facing in advancing climate and environmental action that could benefit from some collective advocacy. And we wanted to highlight some of the key messages we heard, which you see on this slide about the challenges in mainstreaming DRR. Now, as we've spoken about throughout this call, none of these are new or surprising. Having access to suitable funding, technical capacity, support that's accessible on the local level. And we really hope that these challenges can continue to be central tenets for our advocacy in the sector. But in parallel to that, we also want to be sharing opportunities like the ones we heard on this call so far, innovative ideas and creative ways forward. So on the next slide, we have a Mentimeter, and there's a QR code, or you can go to menti.com and enter the code 71788785. And the first question on the Menti is, what are the opportunities you see for mainstreaming DRR, preparedness, early warning, early action in humanitarian programs? We'll make sure to share the link in the chat as Mary opens up the responses. But thinking about this, are you partnering with diverse organizations to tap into technical capacities? Are you collaborating on the country level in program design or securing funding? Maybe you're leveraging existing organizational capacities into existing programs to mainstream DRR. Okay, so we have some responses coming in. Work opportunities is raising awareness and looking for local partners that can intervene in the long term. We have someone writing that there's a real opportunity during the design of programs, which is absolutely true. That's a great way to, from the beginning, think about how to mainstream DRR when you're in the design phase. Partnerships and funding. Great, so many answers coming in. Collaborative partnerships that bring together cross-sectoral representation. Absolutely. And I think what we've heard from a number of our speakers is that there's a real opportunity for collaboration in this work. Mary, if you can scroll down, we can see some more looking at pooled funding. Yeah, that's very interesting. Leveraging climate finance. We heard some from Nick today on ways to do that, and it sounded really exciting, the possibilities there, especially on the national level. Community engagement and preparedness. There are some great responses coming in here, and in a moment we're going to hear as well from two speakers who will just share brief interventions on this. But I actually want to ask just one more question. If you can go to the next question, Mary, on the slide, and we'll actually leave this up as the speakers start, so you can continue to send in responses, because what we'll be doing is compiling some of these inputs and using them for some of the collective advocacy we're doing. And this question is just because we're focusing on financing and the funding piece in particular. It's a time when organizations are having to think differently or creatively. What's one thing your organization is considering doing differently to address funding challenges? Okay, and so some are coming in here. Deepening funding pools, collaboration and partnership. Again, I think that's going to be a theme we'll hear throughout this year. How can we collaborate around funding more effectively? Diaspora engagement, secure local funding. And we heard a lot of this from Paul's interventions as well here. Redesigning programs. Okay, we're going to leave this Menti running, but as we'll turn off the sharing screens, we'll keep collecting those responses. Before we go to questions, we asked two of these signatories who are on the call to share a bit more about why they think it's important for the sector to understand what they think is important for the sector to understand based on their experiences and learning in mainstreaming DRR. So I'll first turn to Joko, who's the national coordinator from Humanitarian Action Africa. If you can just briefly share an overview of the DRR work you're doing in the DRC and what you think the humanitarian sector needs to understand and do to scale up the support for the communities you're working with. And I'll just remind you that we have just a couple of minutes because I want to leave time for Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Natasha. Thank you for introducing me. I am Casimir Joko, a National Coordinator of Humanitarian Action for Africa based in DRC. I'd like to share an overview of the DRR work led by UNDRR in DRC. So at UNDRR, we have taken proactive approach to reduce disaster impact by implementing anticipatory action. This means acting before disasters strike, rather than just responding after the damage is done. Our work is structured around 4 key pillars. First one, humanitarian monitoring and early warning system. We collect and analyze climate hazard data to anticipate disaster and trigger early responses. 2, community-led disaster preparedness. We work directly with local actors, authorities, and communities to conduct joint risk assessments and develop contingency plan. Prepositioning of response mechanism. Before disaster occur, we identify high-risk zone and deploy early warning team, assuring that emergency response can be rapid and coordinated. The fourth one is integration with local governance. We collaborate with village leaders and health authorities to make sure that anticipatory action is embedded in local disaster management plan. What impact has this had? Thanks to this effort, we have seen very well household affected per disaster cycle, faster emergency response, reducing delays in aid delivery, behavioral change as communities are more proactive in disaster preparedness, better coordination among humanitarian actors. But despite the successes, we still face major challenges in scaling up this work. If we want to effectively support vulnerable communities in the face of the climate disasters, the humanitarian sector needs to shift its mindset. Right now, the disaster response is often reactive. We wait for the crisis to happen before mobilizing resources. But we need to invest in prevention and preparedness. Here, how we can make that happen. First of all, invest in prevention, not just response. Anticipatory action saves lives and reduces humanitarian costs, yet most funding remain reactive. We need dedicated funding for preparedness so that communities are not left vulnerable every time a disaster occurs. Secondly, strengthen local capacities. Local communities are the first responders in any disaster. We must invest in building their capacity to act on early warning and develop long-term resilience. Support should go beyond short-term projects. We need sustained funding for local leadership in DRR. And the third one is improve access to DRR funding. One of the biggest barriers to scale up anticipatory action is limited funding. This leaves many frontline responders without financial support for anticipatory action. If we truly want to scale up DRR, we need to expand access to funding for local organizations. And the fourth one, mainstream anticipatory action in national policies. Many early warning systems exist, but communities are often lack of the resources to act on alert. Government and humanitarian actors need to integrate anticipatory action into national disaster response strategies to assure a coordinated approach. And the last one is to enhance collaboration and resource mobilization. We need stronger partnership between humanitarian organizations, government, private sector actors, and climate finance institutions to sustain anticipatory action efforts. Flexible and accessible funding is essential, especially for local organizations like Humanitarian Action for Africa, which are on the front lines of disaster response but lack direct access to the global DRR fund mechanism. My final message: anticipatory action works. We have seen the impact of the preparedness, early warning, and community engagement in reducing disaster risk in my country. However, scaling up requires greater investment, stronger policies, and better coordination. The humanitarian sector must act now. Climate change is accelerating, and communities cannot afford to wait for the next disaster. Investing in prevention today means saving lives tomorrow. And finally, we must break the funding barrier. If we truly want to reduce disaster risk, we need more inclusive funding mechanisms that allow local actors to access resources directly. Thank you for your attention and looking forward.
Thank you very much, Joko. And I think every point you raised is something that we hear from signatories, and especially signatories that are working on the front lines, on the community level, on the local, national level. And these certainly are messages that I'm glad you've brought to this conversation. Sam, I want to turn to you now. Sam Abdo is the Environmental Protection Specialist from the Yemen Family Care Association, also doing some incredible work on mainstreaming DRR and climate adaptation into the work in Yemen. And I want to turn the same question to you. What do you think the sector needs to understand to scale up and support the communities you work with? And again, I'll remind you that if you can keep your remarks to just a couple of minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions for the rest of the panelists. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you so much, Natasha, for giving us this opportunity, and it is a pleasure really joining you in this event. At YFCA, our approach to mainstreaming disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation has evolved over time. As you know, since the conflict or war started in Yemen in 2015, all wars or actions were to support dire need or humanitarian needs such as health and food. It includes all in-kind support. For instance, we used to support one hospital at Shabwa, Governorate. That hospitals used to receive many cholera cases each day. We recognize that most cases are coming from Nisab and Markha Sufla and Bayhan. We formed a team from our team at Shabwa office to conduct assessment at those 3 districts to find out what are the causes of cholera spread in that areas. And we found that those communities are counting on open wells for drinking water. Those wells are, the depth of those wells are among 20 to 30 meters. And it means they are hand-dug wells. They are vulnerable to contaminants. So we coordinated with our donor and partner, DKH, for the next year to establish a new intervention, sustainable intervention, to rehabilitate those wells and end the problem itself. Another example, last year, YFCA developed a community-based disaster reduction guidelines that was distributed to the community we serve in order to increase their awareness to reduce the disasters or risks before they happen or strikes them. I mean, we wanted to introduce anticipatory action into our interventions within the communities we serve, even by voluntary basis, since we don't have enough funds to support such activities. We established disaster risk community committees from the community itself. We trained them on disaster management, anticipatory action. we connected them with meteorological authorities in order to provide them with the alerts regarding any potential hazards. So they disseminate SMS messaging to the other whole community to before the disaster strikes. So the community became aware and prepared before the disasters. Regarding your second questions, and because we are running out of time, and sorry about that, we can, our recommendations to effectively mainstream disaster risk reduction and the climate change adaptations, to shift from short relief to long-term investments, to engage with the national authorities in order to mainstream or adjust your interventions to align with the national adaptation plans and strategies, and also to strengthen localization coordinations and support for local NGOs, since they are the most one engaging with the local communities. Also to integrate climate science and risk assessments within all humanitarian interventions. Thank you so much. Over to you, dear Natasha.
Thank you very much, Sam, and Ramadan Kareem to you and your colleagues. Thanks for your inputs, and also for connecting some of the dots as well on what was shared by other panelists on how to connect some of the ambitions of the humanitarian sector to support this long-term resilience work, and also to align that with the national priorities and where there might be opportunities there as well, as Nick pointed out, in terms of funding. So thank you for that, and thanks for your intervention. Some questions have come in, and wonderful that there's so many panelists that have been responding to these questions as they do. I want to just make sure we leave a few minutes to wrap up. So I'm going to highlight a couple questions and then over to panelists to jump in if they have a response. I want to raise a question that was addressed to the Zimbabwe, where did it go? Or maybe it was answered. It was answered. So I'm gonna turn another question. In light of the recent funding cuts, how are organizations thinking about reorganizing themselves? The rationale is that DRR is part of our daily lives. What are ways, maybe some of the speakers here can touch on the ways that you're reorganizing and rethinking with funding cuts. How has it affected you? What are new ways? The question we asked of the participants, over back to you, panelists, whoever wants to jump in. And there's a question as well on the use of AI to help with data analysis or early warning. I know that Emilia is typing out an answer there, but if there's another person that has a response and wants to jump in, you can. And I'll put one more question out as well, and this is more for Sandra. What are the policy considerations or dialogues on mainstreaming that the humanitarian community could and should contribute to? If there's something you want to add there. So as panelists are starting to type responses, maybe Sandra, you can start with an intervention, and then others can jump in.
Okay, now I'm mute. Yeah, thank you for that. I wanted to, so I'm going to jump to the humanitarian community playing a critical role in contributing to policy dialogues, specifically on disaster preparedness mainstreaming. As you know, there are many cross-cutting areas that we find, I would say, and also related to the current changes. It's not just cuts that we are seeing. We see a change on the priorities, perhaps a change on the messages, a change on it looks like sometimes, right? So first of all, I would say that some key policy areas where we are as DG ECHO, as European Commission, mainstreaming is, I will mention this one, very, very consciously, very, very aware of what I am saying, is gender equality and women's empowerment. So mainstreaming gender considerations into disaster preparedness is absolutely essential. and also to ensure that all humanitarian responses address the specific needs of women, girls, and other marginalized groups. I have prepared an example of good practices and not so good practices. And one of them was related, one lesson learned, I would prefer to call it. I have it here. It's related to a project in Peru, and it's related also to the Global Shelter Cluster. They have used it. I have worked on this specific one with them in the past. There was in Iquitos, Peru. It's a city in South America, and it has the highest rate of gender-based violence. One NGO, it doesn't matter what, they were reconstructing after a wildfire through small-scale projects and community response projects. They were reconstructing to be prepared. The community, they were reconstructing a collective shelter. The collective shelter had collective latrines, collective sanitary facilities, so there were many aspects not taken into consideration. And then with a DG ECHO monitoring visit, that particular partner could redrive, I would say. Then this other aspects, disability inclusion, we are doing lots of efforts from the humanitarian side and the civil protection side to ensuring that all disaster preparedness targeted actions and all humanitarian programs are inclusive and accessible to people with special needs. Specific needs have to be taken into consideration when we are working on preparedness. Environment and climate change, of course, I was not gonna leave that out. Sorry, Natasha, I wait for this one.
I am gonna have to cut you off because we only have a few minutes left of the webinar, and we have to.
Finally, once more is just limit that this one is protection and accountability to affected populations. Over to you. Sorry.
Thank you. Panelists, if anyone has any final quick words, please do jump in. Just noting that we're at the end of time and you've all done an excellent job at responding to the questions in writing. I think we've addressed every question that's come in, but if anyone has final words, please do. Otherwise, I'll hand it over to Nishani to wrap us up.
Thanks so much. Such a rich discussion. I think we should have 2 hours perhaps for this particular webinar. But this conversation doesn't end here. And this is, I think, the important part to highlight. We will be taking some of the work that you've been doing and the lessons learned and experience, expertise, and obviously the opportunities and forward to a few events that are coming up, and also, of course, in discussions in the future. The HNPW is coming up, the Humanitarian Network and Partnership Week in Geneva, but also online. And I think Natasha can share the webinar, the link of the events that are also on our website. You can check out some of them. There's quite a few on funding, on advocacy. So we will take these the messages that we heard today forward to that, and we will be also co-organizing with ECHO an event at the European Humanitarian Forum in May in Brussels. And it will be a conversation on also what are some of the business opportunities or the business case for looking at how we work on environment and climate adaptation, disaster risk reduction across the board with the donors, with the donor declaration signatories and the charter signatories and supporters to the charter. So there's quite a lot of opportunities. And I'm going to quickly hand over to Amelia, who will also share how particularly the DRR is going to be taken forward. Over to you, Amelia.
Thanks so much, and thanks for a great webinar. Just to say that we also have the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction happening in Geneva and online in early June. And we have a session there which also looks specifically at DRR in complex settings, where we will talk about some of the work that's been done so far on integrating DRR in humanitarian action, but also looking at the links to peacekeeping, for example. So I think I think there was a lot of good comments and questions that came out also through the Menti. So what we're going to do is we're going to synthesize some of the findings here from this webinar, synthesize what takes place at the Humanitarian Networks and Partnership Week, and then feed that into that session. That's a fishbowl session where we'll also see quite a few different actors, but financing will definitely have a role to play there. So it will be great also to follow up with the partners to see what are those high-level messages that should be taken forward to the global platform. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And a very special thank you for all of you who remained on the webinar. Thank you all for your questions, your input, and thank you very much to all the speakers who really provided some extremely useful insights to mainstreaming and fundraising on disaster risk reduction, among other things, and disaster preparedness. And we will be in touch. We will put up on our website, on the events page, the recording, the PowerPoints, and hopefully also questions also that we can pull out. So please do continue to engage, and looking forward to the next webinar we will be organizing somewhere down the line. Thank you, everyone. And thanks especially to Mari and Powell for all the technical support to making this webinar a possibility, and to UNDRR and REAP for co-organizing with us. Thanks, Natasha, as well.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Everyone, see you soon.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.